What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a comparison between the Samsung Galaxy A52 5G and the Samsung Galaxy S20 FE. Now, I think this is a pretty interesting comparison because really, for the last year, the S20 FE has been, in my opinion, one of the best value Samsung devices and maybe even overall Android devices that you could buy for the money. But now with the A52 5G, this phone suddenly looks really good, and it might even be a better bang for your buck in comparison. Either way you go, these are two great devices. They offer a lot of features and add-ons that make them well worth the money, and I'm going to go over all the similarities, all the differences, and everything else you need to know about them in this video, so that hopefully you can decide if either one of these phones is right for you. We've got a lot to talk about here, so I won't waste any more time. Let's just go ahead and get right into it and see what these two phones have to offer. First things first, let's actually talk about pricing and availability, because we've already got a few things to consider here. Now, the A52 5G is still relatively new, and here in the US, its full retail price is $499. You can get it unlocked direct from Samsung and through various carriers like T-Mobile and Verizon, and even prepaid networks have it too. And depending on your network or situation, you might be able to snag a discount, but for now, this phone sits at or around that $499 price point. The S20 FE, on the other hand, while it originally retailed for $699 unlocked, prices have come down quite a bit for this device, and you can easily find it on places like Amazon brand new for $599 now, and even well under $500 if you go with an Amazon renewed model. No matter which one you choose, I think you'll probably find the S20 FE remains a little more expensive than the A52 5G a majority of the time, but prices are closer than ever on these two phones, and I don't necessarily think that makes this decision any easier. And if you guys are interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to all the deals and discounts for both of these devices. Physically, at least at first glance, these two phones obviously look pretty similar, and size-wise, they're technically the same. They're both 6.5-inch phones. That's the screen size. And side by side, you can see they're basically the same dimensions. Across the front, everything is set up pretty much the same. There's the center hole punch camera cutout up top, fairly slim bezels all around, and a subtle chin towards the bottom on both. Now, I think the screen to body ratio on the S20 FE is just a tiny bit better than the A52 5G. The black borders seem to be a little more noticeable maybe, but the difference to me isn't really a deal breaker. All in all, from the front, these two phones look pretty close. And both phones also have a totally flat display as well. No curved glass, no edge, and I know most people nowadays prefer totally flat glass setup, so that's why I mentioned it. They're also obviously both pretty big devices, and in the hand you definitely feel that. It's a bit of a stretch for one-handed use, no matter which way you go. But what's sort of interesting actually is how the form factor differs between both phones along the sides and around the back. The S20 FE has a slight curve and contour around the frame that makes the phone feel a little thinner in the hand, while the A52 5G is thick, boxy, and squared off. You probably wouldn't notice unless you held both in your hand, but the difference is there, and I think with that, the S20 FE is just a little more comfortable to hold. As far as the fit, feel, and materials, everything here is the same. Both phones have a polished metal frame, matte plastic rear cover. Actually, they're both water and dust resistant as well. The S20 FE has a slightly better IP rating, but both phones can survive a splash of water. Taking a look around at everything else, on the left side, there's nothing on either device. On the right side, the same power and volume buttons. Up top, both phones have an SD card slot and SIM tray. Down below, what's sort of interesting is that the A52 5G still has the headphone jack that's gone on the S20 FE. There's also the same USB-C port and speaker setup. There's the one speaker down below there and a secondary speaker in the earpiece on both phones for stereo sound, which is great to see, especially on the A52 5G. To me, the out loud listening experience is comparable, I think, and here's an audio sample from each so that you can compare. Around back, both phones have quite the camera setup, which I'll talk about more in just a second. And as far as the unlocking biometrics, both phones do have that in-display fingerprint reader, but with this, I think you'll find the S20 FE can generally get you into the phone much quicker. There's nothing wrong with the A52's fingerprint sensor. It's actually an improvement over the A51 for sure, but the S20 FE's really is just that much better. There's also face unlock on both phones, of course, and again, with this, the S20 FE is noticeably quicker to wake and unlock. And this makes sense when we dive a little deeper here into the specs and performance with each of these phones. The main difference between these devices, really more than anything else, is what you get inside. And this should not come as a surprise. After all, we're comparing an A-series mid-tier Samsung device to the S20 FE, which for all intents and purposes is basically a flagship S-series phone. Powering the A52 5G is a very respectable Snapdragon 750G 5G chipset, an upper mid-tier and fairly new processor. But the S20 FE has last year's flagship spec inside, the Snapdragon 865 5G chipset. And with the Geekbench scores here and a side-by-side speed test in just a second, I think you'll find that there's going to be quite a bit of performance difference between these two phones. What's sort of interesting here though is the A52 5G actually has 8 gigs of RAM inside while the S20 FE has 6. In general, I don't necessarily consider that to be a huge difference, and I think you'll see when we start pushing these phones a little harder that it's the higher end processor that makes all the difference. The A52 5G isn't helped much by the extra RAM, but I wanted to at least point that out. While both of these phones are plenty powerful in general, the S20 FE is almost always going to be the quicker device, no matter what you choose to do. And side by side, while the average everyday stuff is not going to be impacted too much by the higher end processor, the more you push your device, the more you'll see a difference. Even still, I was sort of surprised by how noticeable it was jumping from one app to another on each phone. There was a split-second difference in some instances, a second or two difference in others. Even though the S20 FE sort of has last year's flagship processor, it's still a top-of-the-line spec, and you can see what kind of difference that makes on the S20 FE. As you start to push these phones more and more with third-party apps, and especially with gaming too, here in a second, the difference does become more noticeable, of course. And I think if you're the type of person who constantly has dozens and dozens of apps running, you're constantly switching between stuff, or if gaming is really your thing, the value you get in performance with the S20 FE is just so hard to pass up. Still, the big thing I want to stress is just that it's the load times and animation speeds where the difference is felt most, not in-app or in-game performance. There's no issues at all with the A52 5G, and in fact, it's a flawless phone in every regard. It can do anything and everything you need it to. It's just still not a flagship spec device. It's going to be a little behind, and for most people that's not a big deal. You may not even notice, but for the small percentage of folks who want the top of the line, the best of the best, the S20 FE is your answer here. Also, powering these two phones are the same size batteries, 4,500 milliamps. And from my own perspective here, I haven't found much of a discrepancy in longevity. I do think the Snapdragon 800 series processor on the S20 FE can be more efficient, but the difference, in my experience, if there is one, hasn't been noticeable to me. So when it comes to powering through the day, I can't find an advantage there, though the S20 FE does have wireless charging and reverse wireless charging, so capability-wise, there's more to offer, but battery capacity-wise, and even with charging speeds, there doesn't seem to be an advantage one way or another. What's also surprisingly similar on both phones is the display, and to me, this is where we see another instance of some great overall value on both devices. The 6.5-inch display on both these phones is a Super AMOLED panel with a resolution of 2400 by 1080, and that's all great on its own, but the real kicker here is that both devices also offer a 120Hz high refresh rate mode. This was a fantastic add-on for the S20 FE last year, but like I said, getting it on the A52 5G this year makes it an even more appealing option. These phones feel incredibly quick and snappy. The touches and taps are fast and responsive, and overall I think high refresh rate is the way to go. S-series users, of course, expect this, but A-series users now getting this great feature I think is a huge add-on. As far as the rest of the viewing experience, at least to me, it looks about the same. Color color, clarity, overall picture quality doesn't appear to be at all different. Maybe some slight calibration differences, but you can make further adjustments to the color and settings, so that's not a huge deal. All in all, fantastic displays on both phones, but it's the A52 5G that made leaps and bounds over last year, and I think comparatively for the price, it's hard to ignore the value there. Now, in regards to the camera setups, there's kind of a lot to unpack here, so we'll take it one step at a time. Starting with the actual hardware, these phones have very different setups. The A52 5G has a quad lens setup consisting of a 64 megapixel main lens, 12 megapixel ultra wide, 5 megapixel macro, and 5 megapixel depth sensor. On the S20 FE, you'll find a 12 megapixel main lens, 8 megapixel telephoto lens, and 12 megapixel ultra wide. Both phones have seemingly the same 32 megapixel selfie setup, but as different as those rear cameras seem, specs aren't everything. Inside the app, you'll actually find much of the same stuff. Even most of the shooting modes and features are the same. There's pro mode, night mode, slow-mo, all that stuff on both devices, and some of the even deeper camera settings are all similar across the board. There's really just a few important things to mention here. First off, the A52 5G obviously has a macro lens for up-close pictures. The S20 FE does not offer that. On the flip side, the S20 FE has better optical and digital zoom, up to 30 times total zoom versus 10x on the A52. So that's something to consider. It can certainly be useful in certain situations. And the S20 FE, I think, also utilizes the hardware lenses a little better with portrait shots as well. The A52 5G relies just on that 5 megapixel depth sensor, while the S20 FE has the telephoto lens to use there too. In practice, I actually think overall the S20 FE will consistently deliver a better shot than the A52 5G, no matter how you're shooting. With selfies, the S20 FE captures a lot more detail, and I think the color is balanced a little better as well. With the rear lens setup, again, the pictures are comparable, but when you really start to pick things apart, the detail on the S20 FE is just going to be quite a bit better. There's better skin tones as well, there's less smoothing, it's a nicer looking shot, and like I said, on paper, it doesn't necessarily appear as though the S20 FE is the better setup overall, but those specs aren't everything, and combined with more powerful Snapdragon chipset, I think image processing is going to be the difference here on the S20 FE. All in all, the S20 FE essentially has a flagship camera setup from start to finish at the end of the day, while the A52 5G retains some less capable lenses and slightly less powerful chipset to process the images. So I'm sure it feels like the S20 FE is still the obvious choice here, but let me just say a few final words about these two phones. Overall, the value you do get with the A52 5G is incredible. It's a great phone with a 120Hz display, upper mid-tier specs. It's fully capable, it has a lot to offer, and the price is decent, even in being a brand new phone. It's a great device for the money, but with the S20 FE, Samsung essentially made a cheaper flagship. That's it. That's what this phone is. A less expensive, but still fully capable flagship phone. I think it's still one of the best value Samsung phones you can buy right now, especially since there are places where you can snag this phone for even cheaper than it launched at. But what do you guys think? Which phone would you prefer? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys later.